Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question about the push press, and he's saying, hey, I don't understand how the push press builds the chest when you're kind of skipping the bottom. It's a partial movement. How are you building the chest with it? How do people build the chest with it? So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing. Work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Because, you know, the push press is a very, very misunderstood exercise these days. It's not misunderstood in strength and conditioning circles. People who have to coach field athletes, MMA fighters, everyone else, people who have to hit people out on a field, any sort of field. I don't care whether it's a fighting ring, American football field, a rugby field. The push press is one of the most important exercises in the strength world. Absolutely one of the most important exercises. And it's one of the most important exercises if you plan on being any sort of combat sport athlete. If you're not push pressing and you're going to compete in anything where you have to punch people or hit people or push them, you really are not doing everything you need to do. You're shortchanging yourself. And the problem we get into when you hop over to kind of like the bodybuilding type world, I don't mean competitive bodybuilding because that's bodybuilding, but people who are just trying to put on size and maybe get some performance, they have this very limited mindset sometimes. They have limited mindsets of how different exercises work the body, and they try to think of it as a stack of Legos instead of thinking of the body as one unit and different muscles sequentially doing things in a series and different exercises, and the emphasis changing at different points on the eccentric, concentric reps. They don't always grasp these big, complex movements because they're coming at it from a limited perspective, and hopefully I can help a lot of people broaden their horizons on this and understand how athletes get these benefits from it who are coming from a completely different training world. Although for a long time, bodybuilders were still doing this. Remember pumping iron? Lou Ferrigno was doing some push presses, cleaning the weight up and push pressing. And he certainly wasn't lagging in his shoulders and upper chest department by any means. I think we can all agree there. Now, the thing with the push press is that a lot of people try to think of it as a partial, and they're not understanding the eccentric versus concentric part of the exercise. And that's where a lot of things get misunderstood because they're like, well, you're cheating, but this isn't cheating. This is a controlled cheat because you are using leg drive to initiate the start at the bottom. All right, but you are at the bottom, meaning the bar is all the way down here. It's usually sitting on your shoulders, all right, in a racked back position on the push press. And then you use a little leg drive to get the weight started. Now, that leg drive is the reason the exercise is so valuable for athletes, because you are learning to use your legs to help explode when you press something. Now, anyone who studied any sort of martial arts, boxing, or looked at pushing someone out on a field, that makes a lot of sense, because when you punch someone, your legs and hips and everything else, if you can get them involved, you can hit a hell of a lot harder. And even when you're just throwing a jab or something, there's still a leg drive component to that. There's still a leg drive component to that. I mean, it is an explosive exercise in certain ways for part of the lower body in its own right. But what you have to understand, that's being used to get the weight started so that you can use a heavier weight. Your chest and delts and triceps are still being worked in the first couple inches. They are still pushing the weight up. You're just using that leg drive to get momentum going to get it started on the concentric end of the exercise, right? The concentric end. They're still getting worked almost as much as a strict press. Maybe not quite as much through that part, but they are getting part of it because you're using a heavier weight, right? You can push press more than you can strict press. That's kind of the idea. You're using the leg drive to start a heavier weight to get it moving. Now, arguably, once the weight is moving, you're not getting a lot of that extraness from the momentum. You're still working your chest, though. Your chest is still working on a push press, just like an overhead press. And contrary to what a lot of people might believe, overhead work can still build a big chest. There are plenty of people out there, various athletes, who don't bench press. They don't dip. They don't do any chest presses. They don't do any flies who still have decent sized pecs because they're using a lot of workload overhead. Your chest is still involved in these overhead movements. It is still a strong mover in there, and anyone who doesn't grasp that's not understanding biomechanics, and they're certainly not looking at a lot of athletes out there. So what's going on there? Yeah, the triceps get a tremendous overload at the top. because they are having to lock out a heavier weight than you might normally use. In fact, it's arguable that the push press arguably could be considered possibly one of the top 3 best tricep builders because of the fact that it actually recruits the long head more than most presses do. And the triceps get a tremendous overload on the lockout up there. They do get worked a little harder than you do on a strict press. Now that's the concentric side of things. What people need to understand is that when you start breaking it down, the concentric and eccentric chain has different stress put on it. Because you've used the leg drive to get the weight started at the bottom, yeah, that can de-emphasize some of this area through here at the very bottom, not necessarily the top of the movement. On the concentric side, but what about the eccentric rep? See, that's the thing. People get so confused with this. It's like I tell people eccentric reps have been overhyped. They've been overhyped in the sense that a lot of people think eccentrics are necessary for hypertrophy. Eccentric reps aren't necessary for hypertrophy. You can stimulate maximum hypertrophy and maximum growth, just like Glenn Penley has talked about, the Olympic lifting coach here in the U.S., that he has people go over to nothing but explosive concentric work when he wants to bulk them up into the next weight class. Why? Because all of their hypertrophy has an explosive component to it, which is what he's worried about for his lifters. He wants them to be faster to go with the exercise. He needs them to be faster and pick up speed when they gain weight and gain muscle. But he still gets maximum size out of them because muscle hypertrophy is purely a product of workload, function, fatigue that you can induce to a muscle. At the end of the day, the amount of size a muscle gains is only about how much you fatigue it and the workload you subject that muscle to. It doesn't care what rep range you use to get there. It doesn't care whether you use a concentric rep or an eccentric rep to get there. It doesn't care if you use a combination of rep ranges, exercises, concentric reps, eccentric reps. It doesn't care. It will grow based upon the workload you subject it to. The reason people rotate through workloads is to keep from stalling. Workload is what will cause a muscle to grow. It doesn't care. Now, so when I say that eccentrics aren't required for maximum muscle growth. They're not required for muscle growth. They're not even required for maximum muscle growth. That doesn't mean they're not a useful tool for it. It doesn't mean they're not a useful tool. Now, on the eccentric portion of this lift, you're having to slow down, lowering a weight that's coming down that's heavier than you would do on a strict press, right? Because it's fair to say if you can strict press 160 pounds, you can probably push press 180. It's not unreasonable to assume you've got another 20 pounds on the bar on a push press. Now you're having to handle the eccentric load of that. What muscles are stopping that at the bottom? What muscles are having to take that eccentric load on the way down? Your whole shoulder girdle, but particularly the chest. So the chest is heavily involved, and that's the reason this person is saying, well, I'm also getting chest pumps on the push press. Of course you are. Of course you are. Because your chest is having to handle the eccentric portion of the load. It's having to make up for the difference on the way back down because your legs, your hips, quads, everything else are helping with the leg drive to get it started out of the bottom. But because this is a complex movement that involves multiple joints and 2 different movement patterns, different muscles are handling the concentric versus the eccentric end at the same part of the range of the motion. So that's helping you out of the bottom to get it started, but when it's coming back down, your chest actually is extremely heavily involved. It is probably the most important muscle in slowing that weight down at the bottom on the eccentric end. So your chest is quite possibly, and very probably in most cases, depending on your technique, taking the brunt of the eccentric load. Now the triceps are handling a lot of it as it's coming down towards here, but once you start getting further down, your chest is handling the eccentric load. Well, if you're subjecting your chest repeatedly to a heavy eccentric load over and over, even if it's being de-emphasized a little bit on the concentric end, the lifting of the weight, but it's having to handle the brunt of the lowering, is it going to grow? Is it going to get stimulated? Of course it is. Of course it is. The push press is not a partial movement. It is absolutely not a partial movement. It is a multifaceted exercise. It has 2 different movement patterns going on at the same time. it has two different movement patterns. And because of that, it breaks up the concentric versus eccentric chain a little bit. It changes the emphasis of the two a little differently than it would be on a strict exercise because of the leg drive involved. So it does change things, and it can make it a little bit confusing for people because a lot of people get really confused with something like the push press because they're stuck in that bodybuilder mindset of thinking of the body as a stack of Legos. And this exercise works this Lego and this Lego and this Lego. And they get caught in that mindset without realizing that most really good exercises that build the best athletes in the world, things like power cleans, push presses, deadlifts, it gets very, very difficult to determine which muscles are working or which muscles are the primary movers. Well, the question starts to become, hey, that could be important to know for balancing things out. But what you do know is they all work a hell of a lot of muscles, and if you do those exercises and you do them frequently and heavily with enough workload, you get big. You will get big. Because they work so many different muscles and there's so many different things involved in these exercises, and they do involve heavy weight, lifting it explosively. And remember, guys, explosive lifting, fast lifting, recruits more muscle fibers with the same amount of weight. Some of these exercises you're forced to do explosively. All right, there's a lot of upper threshold muscle fiber recruitment involved. But again, it can be complex to understand these things when you start thinking of the body as a block of Legos, and this exercise does this, this, and this. I mean, that's cute for teaching some basics, but it starts getting thrown out the window when we start getting into big, complex exercises. I mean, we can get into arguments all day long if people don't understand that the lats do have stimulation on the squat because of the thoracic lumbar sling. We've got data showing that the deadlifts massively recruit the lats, possibly just as much as a pull-up does. Even though they're not moving through the same range of motion, they're taking a stabilizing role, they're having to handle so much of it that they light up on EMG studies. The lats light up. It's like, oh my God, it almost looks like you're doing a row or a pull-up when they put electrodes on there and measure the activity in the lats. So it gets very complex when you start dealing with these big, heavy, and explosive movements, particularly ones that have more than one movement pattern involved. It becomes very difficult to start pinning this stuff down. And you can if you want to understand it better, but at a certain point you need to realize that a lot of muscles get heavily worked in these exercises that you're not even thinking of sometimes as primary movers, but they're getting enough stimulation to grow off of. So again, this is something that people need to understand. And when you're wanting to create someone who is both big and strong and explosive all at the same time, these sort of lifts have a lot of value because they train your body to work as one unit, because they work so many muscles, particularly when there's a couple different movement chains involved, like a power clean or a push press. So many muscles get involved that get used at different portions of the lift and different sequences in the kinetic chain, that it starts training your body to work as one unit. And that's one of the big differences between oftentimes an athlete and someone pursuing more bodybuilding type goals. Bodybuilders are only caring about building the stack of Legos. An athlete cares about making everything work at the same time, work all together so that your body becomes one functional, powerful unit. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.